Robert, you are a very much wanted person. You have a mug with your name, which is a copy, which is inspired by Andy Warhol, Most Wanted, right?
Wait.
What's the story in English?
In English, this is a painting by Deborah Cass, who's a contemporary postmodernist artist, and she made a series of portraits of critics and curators in the world of art 10 years ago, and did it based on a series that Warhol had done for the World's Fair here in New York called 10 Most Wanted. And all of those were common criminals. We are uncommon criminals.
Because you write, you are a criminal in a way, right?
I guess so.
But you are not so critic, except for some, because you have published recently a book.
Yes.
Writing on Art from 2006. And so I would like to speak about that and to have your opinion with all your experience. It's very interesting.
Okay, fine. Let me just say, this is the volume 1. This is the first volume. So what you have is the second volume. So it starts in 1980.
Wow, they did not send me the first volume.
They should have sent you the first, but it doesn't matter.
But anyway, one can see that you are quite a precursor. For example, in 2007, you write about Kara Walker.
Yes.
And you speak about social entity, which is universally rooted in the heritage of slavery, which is very much a subject of today, right?
It is indeed. But it has been a subject in our country for way too long because we had slavery for way too long. We had it at all. It would have made it a subject.
But it was less in the zeitgeist. Now it's very important. And probably it's changing the mind of people. What do you think about it now? What's going on now?
Well, I think that's true in the sense that this generation is acutely aware of the legacy of slavery. And finally, but I think also other people in years past in the art world from the 1930s onward were also aware of it. And there's been work about slavery and about the condition of African Americans in this country for a very long time. It's just that the art world wasn't focused on it. The art world was focused on other things, even though art was being made about this. Finally, all of this work is coming to the foreground, both historical and contemporary.
And why do you think they were not focused on that?
Because this is a very racist country, and because it was not what they thought art should be about.
Wow.
They thought art should be about things that were uplifting and beautiful and formally correct or historically necessary. I don't know what the excuses were, but people did not want pictures of the ugliness of their own actions put in front of them.
But Kara Walker did it.
Kara Walker did it, and her father actually belonged to a previous generation of artists who were engaged in exposing these historical and social inequities. So the movement for, Adrian Piper and David Hammons both belong to the generation of the 70s, which is to say my generation, and they've been doing this for their entire careers.
Yeah, true. But you have a chapter about David Hammons, which is quite funny, where you begin with a story about the fact that you never know when he shows up, but you had the privilege to see him. Could you describe David Hammons, his behavior, his way of being? How did you meet him?
I met him, I don't know where. I met him in Rome for the first time, I think. And
Rome?
He was in an exhibition at the American Academy in Rome. He was paired with Yanis Kounelis.
Okay.
And the two of them were given spaces in the area which is the American Academy, the Villa Aurelia and all of that. And each one of them did an exhibition, and I was asked to come and write a catalog for that show. And I'd met him under the circumstances, but I hadn't really had much to do with him. And so I came and did that, and then we hit it off. And then when I did my first exhibition at MoMA, he was one of the 6 artists or 7 artists actually involved.
And but when was it in Rome?
In Rome, it would have been about 1991 or 2 or something like that.
And you speak about his affinity with Arte Povera.
Yes, I mean, David has independently arrived at the place that Arte Povera was involved with also, which is the idea of making something out of virtually nothing and making a permanent image, a memorable image out of a perishable material. And so the first time I think I really encountered his work was a piece called Delta Spirit, which was a kind of cabana that he built out of scrap lumber that he found on the beach in Lower Manhattan, back when Lower Manhattan had a beach. And he pulled it all together. He pulled about a lot of alcohol bottles together. He used all this detritus, all this garbage, and made a kind of a refuge and a place to have meetings where people could gather to play music, where they could talk and so on. And that was, again, this was outside in public space in Manhattan. He also did at the same time a piece in Park in Brooklyn, which was called Higher Goals, which was a series of telephone poles covered with the metal caps from beer bottles, and he nailed them down so the whole pole became this beautiful object, similar to things one will find in Africa, made with cowrie shells and others, but completely New York in other ways. And that was, again, a very public piece in downtown Brooklyn.
But recently he did a public piece which is very costful for the Whitney. It's not Arte Povera anymore.
No, it's not. That's quite right. You're quite right.
What do you think about this work?
I think it's beautiful, and I think it's the ghost of what used to be there, but it is a different shift. And when I did my first exhibition at MoMA, he was in it, and I had a budget for the artists to spend on materials and labor or whatever they needed, and it was not very much. It was $10,000, and I told him I would give.
What year was it? What year?
What?
What year was it?
That was 1991 also.
Okay, and? Sorry.
And so I said, David, I had this amount of money for you. It's not very much, but it'll get you somewhere. And he found that it was too much money, and it threw him off stride, and he didn't know quite how to spend it. So,
And but how is this man? He's very special, right?
He's very special. He's very, very subtle. He's very determined to do the things he wants to do, his way of doing them. So he doesn't play the art world game very much, but he plays it. Just not he does play it, but he stays in the game, but he stays in the game by being always at the edge of the game, and that serves a function which it both draws attention to him and it also draws attention to where the edge really is.
And do you think he's an heir of Marcel Duchamp because he's making a lot of ready-made oriented work?
Well, everybody's an heir of Marcel Duchamp, but he is not a respectful, dutiful heir. He's not an academic Duchampian. And in fact, he took Arturo Schwartz's book of Marcel Duchamp and changed it, altered it. So he's a rebellious great-grandson of Marcel Duchamp.
But to say Marcel Duchamp and academic is really opposite, no? There's no academy with Marcel Duchamp.
But in fact, the academy is full of academic Duchampians. And
which is very boring.
Which is very boring, yeah. But much of what we think of as postmodern art is, in fact, Duchampian academicism. People who are trying to get themselves into line with history rather than just to make history.
And you also, in the same article about Kara Walker, you were speaking about Romare Bearden.
Yes.
That people are rediscovering now too.
They are, yes.
What do you think about this artist?
I think he's a very interesting artist. I think he's very, I won't say uneven, but the best works are very much superior to the average works. And he was an extremely skillful collagist, and he was able to make very beautiful things. But the best works are not just beautiful, they're dense with information and contradictions and the conceptual materials.
And so is he important for you?
Is he what? Is he important for me? Yes, he was. Yeah. I've again, when I was at MoMA, I had a chance to deal with all of these artists because I had an historical collection to go through and bring out. So I had a show where I had a Romare Bearden juxtaposed to a photograph by Walker Evans of the side of a southern barbershop or something like that, which had racist caricatures on it. The Bearden on the other side was made out of images of African masks. And he clipped out the details that were distinctly African in the features of the people in the masks, and the exaggeration of those features on one side and on the other side was very similar, but the intent was entirely opposite. One was to caricature and to mock, one was to celebrate.
But why do you think he was a bit, more than a bit, forgotten?
He hasn't really been forgotten, but he's been institutionalized because he was in an exhibition at MoMA in the 60s which was very important. I think he was one of the first, if not the first, African American artist to have a solo show there. And he became the kind of the person that MoMA could point to and say, "See, we did it."
Alibi.
Late, but they did it. Yeah, but you know, and so number one, he was being tokenized. Number two, he made a lot of very decorative work, which I don't think is so interesting, although there's nothing embarrassing about it. And so, what is most radical about Bearden was lost track of. On the other hand, Bearden was around when I was here in New York early on, and you would see him in coffee shops and so on near the Whitney, and he was very accessible to other artists, and he was a figurehead in a true sense. He was somebody that represented a successful career by an African American artist, and he was abordable. He was abordable. That's important.
That's very interesting because we forgot that, right?
Yeah.
I forgot. I never know. But would you think he influenced?
I think he influenced a lot of artists that you may never have heard of. David Driscoll and lots of African American artists were heavily influenced by him. And he was also part of a group of artists that was mixed black and white when he came to the fore. And there was a book that was written by, I'm trying to remember now, it was a much discussed book in the 80s. It's a Belgian critic, and it's called How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. And that book goes into a lot of case studies of artists who were on deck to become really well known and then were brushed aside by abstract expressionism. And he was one of them.
Okay, very interesting. And so there's also a chapter dedicated to your writing in 2007 about feminism in art, feminism, yes. And how has feminism in art changed? It was 2007, we are in 2022. So what has changed? There's a third
maybe fourth or fifth. Okay, first of all, in terms of my own personal history, I have two sisters. I had two surrogate mothers who were lesbians. I have always lived in a matriarchal world. It's really important to pay attention to the work of women because I have always paid attention to the work of women. So what I've actually seen is the evolution of that work and the changing discourses within the women's world of feminist art movement. And there was a point in the 70s and 80s particularly where there was a kind of an essentializing thing of trying to find feminine symbols, feminine icons, the history of women's art and so on. We've moved from there to something different, which is more structuralist in nature, is more sophisticated intellectually, is not necessarily better as art, but it is definitely different. And now, of course, people are looking at the fact that women are not, they're women of every color, of every tradition. So you can't speak any longer of women versus men, a simple binary, but you have to speak of women in different cultures.
And so that's the change, the big change of today, you think, in the art?
I think that's the big change in feminist art, yeah. I don't think everybody is a feminist artist by any means, but...
You know. Yeah, but and what's the consequence on the art world?
The consequence is that, well, first of all, the art world is a nebulous thing. The art world is partly the art markets, partly the magazines, it's partly just the things that people say, the lieu commun of a given time and place.
True. But what did you observe?
What I've observed is that the art world has almost been gutted in terms of what I knew it to be, and it is almost now entirely commercial and institutional.
What does it mean? Could you give an example?
Well, all the people talk about when they're out in the evening is they talk about the price of things or who's in which gallery and who's getting the most publicity and so on and so forth. Or they talk about institutional issues. They say, well, this is what MoMA is doing. This is what the Whitney is doing. This is what Guggenheim is doing. What they don't talk very much about is the art itself. And they avoid that in many cases because they're unsure of where the discourse is or where it should be going, and they don't want to make fools of themselves. So the loss of sophisticated conversation about contemporary art is dramatic in the past 5-10 years.
But do you think that, for example, when Marcel Duchamp was selling Brancusi sculpture, he was speaking about the quality of the work?
Well, he knew that it had quality. Now that's one of the great ironies, because the fact that Brancusi was in the market was something most people, not the Duchamp was in the market, was something that most academic Duchampians don't want to deal with. Most academic Duchampians sort of marry, and in a very strange marriage, a radical Marxist idea with a very radical un-Marxist artist, Duchamp. Duchamp is not a bit Marxist. So
Of course.
when you put the two of them together, you come up with what we think of as American postmodernism, right? And I don't think that it's an accurate picture of anything. So to be reminded that Duchamp was in fact a dealer and was a socialite and was a kept man and had many women who kept him, that is a corrective long overdue to the myth of Duchamp and to what his myth has done to legitimize a lot of very puritanical attitudes towards art and many other issues too.
You know, I'm writing now about an auction organized by Duchamp for Picabia at Drouot Auction House.
Yeah.
He did it in the 20s or beginning of
Yeah.
30s, and he completely organized the auction for him, for Picabia.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he liked to play it with the market. That's obvious.
Obvious, and it so happens that I have a member of my family was involved in that period, Duchamp very well. He tried to sell her things, you know. So.
So do you think the quality of conversation today is lower in terms of speaking about art is lower than 20 years ago?
Yes, I do. And I think it's not only lower, but it's also more pretentious because it sounds like academic discourse, but it isn't because there's no academic thinking, research, historical consciousness behind it. It's just buzzwords. And buzzwords are used in lieu of actually saying something direct and based on the experience of works of art or of situations.
Don't you think it's because the circle of people interested by contemporary art is a lot larger?
It's a lot larger. It's made up of many more commerçants. It's made up of many more academics, and the academics talk to each other. Yes, and the academics talk to each other, and the commerçants talk to each other, and they all sort of lecture the collectors, and that's where it is. It's not any longer about an experience of works of art, where at the end of the day, maybe somebody buys something or writes something. It begins there, and it doesn't get much farther.
And so what to do?
What to do? I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things I chose myself to do was to write contrarian essays wherever possible, and I did a lot of them. But that's also a reason that I've been more or less shut out of certain corners of the art world because people just don't want to have those conversations.
Wow. Okay.
And this book that you got has been, there've been only a couple of reviews in the entire country.
That's interesting. But anyway, no one is reading anymore. You ought to have made a video of your book.
I'm afraid that's true. But, you know.
Because the problem is not only about the disinterest for art. Yeah. I mean, speaking about art, it's the real point is about people are not reading anymore. They watch Netflix.
They watch Netflix. I watch Netflix too, so I can't wag my finger too much. But you know, the point is that yes, you're right. You're right. They do.
I think that's a problem about our job today. That's why I'm doing videos with you.
Okay, well then we should write each other letters after this. Okay, just to prove that we can still
balance. And it's interesting because next June there's an exhibition at Centre Pompidou with Tatiana Trouvé, and in 2008 you wrote about Tatiana Trouvé already.
Yes, indeed, I did. Yes.
And you wrote about work which speak about introspection and memory effect.
Yes, and I put it in my Biennale in 2007. Before that, even.
Yes,
so I've known about her work for a long time, and I really am impressed by her and like what she does.
Why are you impressed?
Because it is work that has a very unsettling presence. It is not a big, dramatic, explosive kind of thing. It's very quiet, but it is very uncanny. I have to say that. And it's a little bit surrealist, but it's not in the manner of surrealism. It's a little bit Duchampian, but it's not really Duchampian. It is her own way of dealing with the estrangement of objects and situations, and she does it wonderfully well. Yeah,
and for me, it speaks also about trauma, no?
Yes, yes. And I think it's also important that she is herself a multicultural person. She has African roots, she has Italian roots, she has French contacts, and so when you're talking to Tatiana, you're talking to a person who is at the nexus of all kinds of things that are being debated in abstract categorical terms, and she is the non-categorical corrective to that way of thinking.
Very true. She's fascinating. And as a lady artist, Alice Neel, you met her in 1978.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's fantastic, no?
She was no lady. She was no lady.
And I saw recently a show. There was a show in New York, and recently at Guggenheim Bilbao, and now it's going to be in Centre Pompidou. So, what can you say about her work, and why did it take so much time to be recognized?
It took so much time to be recognized in this country because she was a realist painter. And people were not interested in realism. They were interested in expressionism. They were interested in minimalism. They were interested in things that looked like modern art, but not things that look like painting has looked in the past at all. Now, she was a very direct kind of realist. She was an observational realist, and she was a kind of inspiringly awkward realist. She didn't have academic skills. She made pictures in a very, boom, boom, boom kind of way. But she also was kind of a wonderfully witty and contrarian person, and she was a real bohemian of a kind they don't make anymore, I don't think. And so when Alice was in the room, you knew she was there because she was like nothing else in the room, no one else in the room. And she was very interested in the particularities of people, their physiognomies, but also their psychologies, the chosen roles. And she was a portraitist of all the role playing that went on during her time in New York. And so you see drag queens, you see perfectly banal business people, you see fashion people, and so on. Everything is there. And in that respect, she's very similar to Warhol, who she painted.
And she painted Warhol, yeah. She made the portrait with a scare, right?
That's right, yeah. But she's a kind of old-fashioned studio Warhol.
But so why would she belong to the zeitgeist now?
That is a good question. And I think maybe it's nostalgia for the times before everything was processed, explained, and put through so many synthesizing and homogenizing machines in the system. She was just very raw. She's very raw.
But yes, but there's a fashion for figurative art today. Very much.
There is, but that has never really gone away in this country, but it's often been sort of kept down by the commercial world, the museum world, and so on and so forth. Now, when I was at MoMA, for example, they had bought Alice's work back in the day when she was making it in the 40s, and they have a wonderful portrait from that time, and they have some other things since then. So in places that collected her when she was on the scene as a young woman, there have been Alice paintings for a long time. But it's only recently that museums that are newly founded or that are just beginning to turn their attention to historical records have been interested in her. And there's a lot of work. When I went to her apartment, I remember you walked around, it's a little bit like this apartment, this house. There was things everywhere, right? And you had to walk with your arms in like this so that you wouldn't knock paintings off the wall. They were stacked several deep. And she just painted and painted and painted, and it accumulated. That's good because now, if you peel away the layers, there's always another layer underneath. There's another painting that has not yet found a home.
Yeah. But she had different style through her career. Huh? The end was more social, I think.
No, she painted in a consistent method, I would say, and she mastered it. Her color changed; it got brighter later on. But it was a kind of a caricature method. I mean, she had a simple, like a blue or a yellow. She'd put that down as a contour, then she'd flesh out the parts that were of more interest to her, and so on. She'd build out from the center of this sort of very simple kind of armature that she drew, and that was old-fashioned studio technique at work.
But you said that figurative painting was not so successful, and I think about one article you wrote about Alex Katz.
Yes.
Who was successful early on already?
He was successful early on, and then he was out of fashion, and then he's back in fashion. So he's going through the cycle that many artists go through. In fact, I'm going to go see him this afternoon. So I'll tell him.
I interviewed him recently. He had a big show in Paris about water at Tadeusz Ropak.
I saw the catalog. It's a beautiful catalog.
Yeah, very interesting.
But no, Alex is 95 years old. Okay. So he paints young, but he's not young. And he's waited all this time to get the kind of attention that his contemporaries got sooner. He's roughly a contemporary of Rauschenberg. He is a contemporary of Warhol, all of those people, and all of them had big careers starting in the early 60s. He had a career, but not a big one. His prices weren't very high. His institutional representation was below what it should have been. So it's only now that he's in his 90s that he's getting what is his due. But I think he's a remarkable painter.
Why?
Because he has figured out a way to generate images with the least kind of Sturm und Drang, with the least kind of melodrama. And at the same time, he's accurate about how things look at this particular moment. So he's attentive to the clothes people choose, to the expressions that they wear as masks, to all the things that make them of this particular moment. And if you take, Baudelaire seriously, the painter of modern times does that. That's what the painter of modern times is. The painter of modern times is a realist about the fashions of the day.
But Baudelaire was better in his poetry than in his art criticism.
I disagree.
I think Apollinaire was really much more accurate.
I think Baudelaire was very accurate, but I think they are of a different moment. And I admire Apollinaire also, but I think Baudelaire is my man. In fact, okay. he's right here on the wall. So
you take Baudelaire, I take Apollinaire.
Okay, you can have him. I mean, I respect him.
Apollinaire, I mean, he guessed everything. He was really very impressive. And but on another kind of artist, very far from that, we have Damien Hirst. And you wrote about him in 2017 about the big show at Pinot Foundation, and you wrote very funny things. It's a very funny article, in fact, which was translated, I think, recently. You wrote it for Corriere della Sera. And you said about Pinot, he has teamed up with a world-famous surveyor of luxury goods. Is it an allusion to Christie's or to other brands?
Yeah, but to Christie's, to Pinot himself, is in that business. No, but I mean, Hirst is a clever man. He's not an interesting artist. As an artist, he's not an interesting.
Never, not even at the beginning. You think in the 90s?
He's an academic Duchampian. Okay, he didn't do the urinal. He did the shark, and it was a bold gesture, and it's a impressive object. But it doesn't change the way I think about the world very much. But it is a very good way of playing the art game. So I give him that. But I don't think he's done a lot of work, and he's certainly not done much in recent years that's inventive or interesting or where the forms are that good.
But what he did in Venice was Treasure from the Wreck of the Unbelievable was super kitsch, right?
Super kitsch, yeah.
But grand. I mean,
grand, uber kitsch. Yeah, exactly.
And you also write, he made his mark in the history of finance.
Exactly so, because I think that is true also of Jeff Koons, that there's art history, and there's a history of taste, and there's the history of transactional art sales. And I think Hirst and Koons are especially important in the latter category, because there's no question that they've changed art history, but they've changed it as businessmen, not as makers of form. Now, you can say Warhol did the same thing, and I think Warhol did the same thing, but he also did the other two things better.
But you think Hirst and Koons are comparable, really?
Yeah, in broad terms, yeah.
Don't you think that Koons invented some forms that Damien Hirst did not?
That's true, and I think Koons is the more interesting of the two.
Of course.
But I think they're in similar kinds of positions in relationship to Warhol, who is their real competition.
Bon, c'était un plaisir. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, and thank you. And I hope you have good results from this.
Of course.